Kabir Helminski, a spiritual leader in the Sufi tradition, has been coming to Garrison Institute pretty much since we opened our doors, doing a yearly retreat here with your group, the Threshold Society. Kabir, can you give us some context on the particular tradition and lineage, just for many of our viewers and listeners who might not be familiar with Sufism? I know that it's part of larger Islam, and that it's a strand of Islam, and that there are orders that are sort of the equivalent of what a Buddhist would say is a lineage. Can you give us the context of where you are in that landscape?
Sure.
And what Sufism is briefly, and where you are in that.
All right. Sufism is the mystical teaching within Islam. It goes back 14 centuries to the Prophet Muhammad, although for many centuries it did not emerge as an explicit lineage or as organized Sufi orders. That began to happen around the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries as the needs of the world required it. Until that time, mysticism was very diffuse within Islamic civilization. There were mystics, but not yet organized as schools or lineages. But beginning, especially in the 12th and 13th centuries, some great figures arose, and one of those was Rumi, who is the source of our particular lineage, which is called the Mevlevi order, or Mevlevi Tariqa, and Tariqa means path. So Sufism is a path. It's the esoteric path within the broad religion of Islam. So we trace our lineage back to Rumi, and over the last approximately 7 centuries, the Mevlevi order has been a strong spiritual and cultural force, particularly within the Ottoman world and now in the contemporary world. During Ottoman times, it was a refuge, it was a community for artists, musicians, composers, poets, intellectuals. It was a mystical order that attracted people with those aesthetic and intellectual interests. There are other Sufi orders that attracted people of different types. There were some orders that attracted, for instance, people in the Ottoman administration, people who were civil servants, you might say. There are other orders that were primarily rural, and there were some other orders that attracted people with commercial interests. Not that it was exclusively so, but there are many branches of this tree of Sufism, and we're not in competition with each other, because any more than branches of a tree would be in competition with each other. And when I meet sheikhs from other orders, as I did recently in Morocco, where 1,000 Sufi sheikhs were invited by the king of Morocco, and I met people from West Africa, East Africa, North Africa, the Arab world, the Middle East, farthest Asia, France, California. We always find that we have a common language and a common understanding, that there's a coherence that underlies the teaching as a whole. A common vocabulary which traces back to the Quran. And with minor variations, there's a common practice and principles. So as different as we might be culturally, there is this underlying unity and ability to communicate and understand each other, which is one of the beautiful riches of Sufi tradition.
And how would you characterize that underlying coherence of teaching and practice? What is the kernel there? What is that central cohering element?
Well, what gives it its coherence is its reliance upon the divine reality, which we could call Allah, and we could call it a number of things. We could also call it the real. Haq is one of the synonyms for Allah. So Sufis are searching for what is most real. And there is a sense that there is something, and not that it's a thing, but if you like, a dimension of existence which is the ultimate unity and which has its own qualities, and these qualities include nurturance, love, infinite intelligence, magnanimous generosity, and that these qualities like these are in the nature of reality itself. And when we take our attention from being exclusively focused on the multiplicity, in other words, on the facts of everyday life, and we reorient ourselves towards a perception of this divine reality, which is not separate from or other than the multiplicity, but which encompasses the multiplicity, with that shift of attention, with that heart perception, we open to that reality and ultimately are transformed by it. Rumi gives this example. He says, deep in the bowels of the earth, dense opaque stone, granite, receiving the emanations of an invisible, radiant, spiritual sun, dense stone is being transformed into jewels. Granite is turning into rubies. And the process of contemplation, and for us contemplation is both in silence and stillness and also in activity, that continual conscious relationship with that divine reality transforms our stoniness into rubiness. And so if a stone says I am, it's in a sense an enemy of the light. It blocks the light. But if a ruby says I am, it's a transmitter of the light through its transparency. So Rumi says, if the ruby loves the sun, it's loving itself. And if it loves itself, it's loving the sun. Because the ruby became a ruby through this relationship to that invisible spiritual sun. So that's a symbol for us, or it's one metaphor of hundreds that I could give. But it's one metaphor for the process of human transformation that comes through contemplation. And contemplation is, well, it's such a broad subject. On one level, it's stilling the mind, quieting the emotions, so that we can be empty enough to be available or present for that divine presence, that spiritual reality. So it begins with that stilling of the mind and heart and the focusing of attention or refinement of attention, and also removing the veils of egoism that often distort that relationship to the divine or to the real, to truth as it is, and truth not as an intellectual formulation, but truth as a perception, ultimately a non-dual perception of the simultaneous reality of human individuality in partnership with ultimate divine reality. And you deepen in that perception, you deepen in that realization through everyday life, through what we call remembering God, which is called zikr in Sufi language. So zikr is the ultimate state of spiritual consciousness. It's the everyday and the ultimate state. It's the ultimate practice, simply remembering that vast, infinite context of the divine reality and our place in it. That's the essence of Sufi practice.
That's very beautifully stated. And I'm very struck at the care with which you chose your words, your concept. And I'm also struck with the universality of pretty much everything that you said. And there's a couple different ways of thinking about the place of dogma, practice, tolerance, unity, diversity. You know, there's one strand that says the difference is the most important thing, because you know one can't wash away, can't whitewash differences, and you know the truth is the truth, and you know one can't compromise but so much. You know you have to be faithful, you know, to the beliefs of your tradition. There's another strand that says, well, you know, the vocabulary doesn't really matter. You know, the so-called perennial philosophy school, Houston Smith, the Gentle Soul, talks about this a lot, that, you know, beyond the vocabulary, it's all the same thing. It's all the same reality. And the first seems at least out of date. The first seems at least to be from a former age of less tolerance. The second may be overly facile. It may be sort of a wishful attempt to wash away differences. What about that? What do you think about that? How does this come together?
That's all you want to ask me? Is that?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Let's start, first of all, from the perspective of Orthodox Islam, that terrifying phenomena in our mostly Islamophobic society. From the perspective of Orthodox Islam, whatever your beliefs, whatever religion you follow, if you do the good and believe in or trust in a final accountability, or accept a final accountability, you will have nothing to fear and no reason to grieve. This is Orthodox Islam. Christians, Jews, and theoretically, countless recipients of divine revelation from countless numbers of prophets that have come to humanity have all been taught the truth, and those that do the good and accept accountability will have nothing to fear from God. So Islam begins with that rather inclusive understanding. It never claims to have a monopoly on the truth. In fact, it says God could have created us as one people, but we were created as different nations, races, groups, communities, in order that we might know one another and presumably benefit from knowing one another. So, at the same time, there is in the Quran the notion that Muhammad came as the seal of the prophets. Seal in this case means the verifier, authenticator of all previous revelations. And at the same time, the Quran is full. It has its own critique of what human beings have done in the name of religion, the corruption of man-made beliefs. So there is a critique of other religions and even of what could happen to Islam itself. And I'll give you an example. The Quran, in one very powerful verse, says, "Do you dare to forbid what God Himself has not forbidden?" So there's a warning there that human beings tend to add prescriptions and rules and burden people with these things. So the Quran also warns against any, shall we say, metaphysical interloper, anyone who gets in the way between people and God. So the worship of religious figures, the idolization of anything or anyone is warned against. So in general, there's this inclusive vision that Islam has, and an acceptance of the authenticity of the original message, and at the same time recognition that human beings, through our own corruption or egoism, can introduce false man-made beliefs into the original, pure divine message. Now, when it comes to the place of doctrine in Sufism, we consider it very important because doctrine and the simple teaching about the purpose of human life, the nature of the human being, the nature of human consciousness, the purpose of all of this, and particularly about the possibility of our relationship to the divine and cultivating that relationship and ultimately surrendering to the divine. These are the rather simple doctrines of Islam, which were carried into practice, into mystical practice and experiential teaching by the Sufis. So there's, for instance, a powerful verse in the Quran that says, "Indeed, with God, the only true religion is self-surrender." Now, the word for self that I'm translating as self-surrender is Islam. Mm-hmm. Now, but when this verse was revealed, there wasn't yet the formal institution of Islam. There wasn't yet anything quite like Islam as a religion, as we know it today. And it's clear that the word Islam, when it occurs in the Quran, refers to a state of being, not to a religion. That's why Moses, Jesus, Abraham were all Muslims in the Quran and followed Islam. So Islam is not the unique privilege of today's so-called Muslims, but it's a state of being. It's a state when you, in a sense, give up the false self and come into relationship, which we call submission or surrender, to the divine reality, not to a set of religious prescriptions or dogmas, but it's an existential state, way of being. So, to me, this is an example of a way in which doctrine can rectify the distortions of human egoism as they creep into our spiritual paths. Indeed, with God, the only true religion is self-surrender. If it's not self-surrender, if it's mere ritual, if it is some kind of authoritarian structure, if it is a set of irrational dogmas, it's not religion in the sight of God. So, the formulations of Islam are beautiful and simple and inclusive, and go so far as to say, you cannot really say anything about Allah. You cannot capture Allah in a concept. You cannot define Allah. So Allah is left almost as undefined as Buddhist shunyata. God is not a thing, God is not a person, but God, Allah, is the ultimate, subtlest state of everything, the origin and purpose of everything, the first and the last, the inner and the outer, the all-compassionate, the wisest of judges, the most subtle, the ever-living, the all-hearing, the all-seeing, the all-knowing. There are these different attributes, but ultimately the essence cannot be limited by any concept. So we value the formulations, especially those that come through revelation, in this case the Quran, which is a kind of reference point for all Sufi and Islamic teaching, and which contributes to that coherence I mentioned before, when sheikhs from Mali meet a sheikh from Pakistan and a sheikh from California, are immediately on the same page because of that coherence of the original teaching. And then it's applied in different ways, it's lived in different ways, but there is that fundamental coherence. And there's also an orthopraxis. All Muslims basically read the same holy book, the Quran, basically perform the same ritual prayer, which is our worship and a kind of physical yoga, and which is invalid without mindfulness. The Prophet said, without mindfulness, the ritual prayer is not valid. So it becomes a training for mindfulness. And then there's an annual fast. There's a few key practices that are the orthopraxis of Islam, and which define what Islam is as an orthopraxis. How you understand these things is you're left free. There's not mind control. Historically, there's not been that kind of mind control. You must believe this about this. It's not, you must believe this teaching about Muhammad. No. Muhammad was a beautiful example. He brought a message. The message is in the Quran. The practice is prescribed. You do the best you can with it. And the Quran is understood on many levels. It cannot be understood as a literal truth, because the Quran is full of statements like, wheresoever you turn is the face of God. How could you understand that literally except by being a raving mystic? So the Quran has all those levels in it. It has the mystical and the practical.
Thank you. What you've described is a reality that is more than, bigger than, deeper than, more expansive than, more real than our small self and the stories through which we construct and shape and describe that self.
Exactly.
And there are words that are used that are different in traditions to describe that reality, but that is the ultimate reality. It's more real than the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves and about life. And it is both the source and the goal.
Yes.
And that is, in fact, it seems to me, true of every path. That's what every path is geared toward uncovering. And so maybe there is a perennial philosophy after all.
The Quran would affirm that. It would, in fact, it talks about, the word for religion in Arabic is din, D-I-N, and it means something more universal than any particular religion. It is what it all adds up to. you might say. And it's the truth, the bottom line, the metaphysical bottom line. And it is said to run through all of human history. And there's even the very remarkable statement, do not be among those who break the deen into separate sects, each rejoicing in what it alone has. You know, I don't think many human beings understand the import of that, but it's there. Do not break the religion. It doesn't say this religion or the religion of Islam. Do not break the religion into sects. See it as one. And it also says, there have been countless prophets. Do not make any distinctions among them as to who is better or worse. Accept them all.
Thank you.
A pleasure.